Now, I'd like to begin by just introducing you to a wonderful word that has been the source of my research inspiration for about 17 years, and that word is juvenescence. Has anybody heard of that word? Has anybody adopted that word? It's a word that I discovered intentionally because I was looking for a word to describe the future environment that as leaders that we've got to steer our organisation into. And so my whole presentation is going to be based around this one question that I've been now researching and reporting on for some 17 years. Now, before some of you think, well, goodness, after 17 years, hasn't he answered this question? Well, this question's fascinating because unlike a puzzle where we know that there is an answer, or we know that through certain problem-solving techniques we'll get to the answer, this question behaves more like a mystery. Just when you think you know where the corner is and what's around the corner, something changes. Now, the last decade for Australia was really characterised by this. It was one of the most disruptive decades we have experienced across all aspects of our society. We became world famous for the more changes of leadership, political leadership, than any other nation on earth. We saw trust erode in our systems, in our leaders, to its lowest point ever. We saw technology arrive and fundamentally change every aspect of our society. The mobile phone, we've got to remember, the smartphone has only been here for a very short period of time. It's only been here for about 12 years. Yet in that very quick period of time, it has created trillion-dollar industries, it has profoundly changed the way we experience the world, and it's become our gateway to the world. We saw the emergence of this national priority to address the skills shortages that we are now all confronted with across all aspects of the technological and scientific areas. And then lastly, of course, we experienced our lowest points during that decade of where we all felt as a nation that climate change was not a major issue. And so the politicisation of that issue through the flip-flopping of policies throughout that period had a profound impact on the way that we feel about climate change. And so we're all left at the end of that decade really thinking about one question, and that is just where the bloody hell are we? So I put that question to approximately 700 executives across Australia that included about 170 CEOs, boards of directors and the like. And so today I'm going to share with you the insights of that piece of research that are captured in my new book, Australia 2030, Just Where the Bloody Hell Are We? So we're going to talk about the fourth industrial revolution. Why? Because this coming decade will be the decade where we will all, as individuals, as leaders in our organisations, across every industry and right around the world, are going to have to adapt to this fourth industrial revolution. The second area I'm going to talk about are these major technological shifts. Think of these as like the corners, the signposts of what might just be around that corner. I'll then talk about the programmatic decade. The programmatic decade needs to be thought of as the fusion between our digital, physical and biological worlds. Then lastly, we'll get to some predictions that I've made, and also augmented some of the wonderful predictions made by other thought leaders around the world in terms of what we can anticipate and expect this coming decade. Okay, let's begin with the fourth industrial revolution. This is coming whether you are ready or not, and it is already here and manifesting itself across all aspects of our society. Now, what is an industrial revolution? Now, the best way to think about this is that when we see the convergence of three critical systems, we see a profound change in the way economic value is created. And of course, those systems are energy, logistics, and communication. So in the first industrial revolution, We saw that manifest in terms of steam, which was our energy source. We applied that to locomotion and allowed us to move goods and services from what was primarily a sort of sea-based or waterway-based sets of societies. In the second industrial revolution, we saw the rise of fossil fuels together with electricity that allowed us to then create mechanisation, and we were able to move goods and services using air, road and rail right across international borders. And of course, we saw the rise of telecommunications. The third industrial revolution, characterised by nuclear power, computing and the internet. Now, the fourth industrial revolution is no different. There are a whole group of new and emerging technologies, these are just some of them, that will have a profound change in the way with which we think about the creation of economic value. In other words, we'll see completely new ways upon which economic value will be created. Now, to put this into a strategic context, I'll refer to this as a new economic physics. Now, what's important to understand here is that up till this point in time, we've had in our economic thinking a direct relationship between demand and growth and supply or access to resources and time. Now, what we are seeing here is a separation of those pieces of thinking. So typically, how does that play out? So if you follow the linear curve, typically the way that we've applied this is that if we want to grow our organisations 5% next year, we're going to need this much capital, we need this much FTE, we need this much input to get a growth outcome. But what we're now seeing is this exponential curve emerge, this exponential curve which again separates those key areas. Now, the inflection point of where disruption occurs is where a business model that is exponential crosses the linear curve, because that is the point upon which a linear-based model can no longer compete up against an exponential model. Let me give you an example. Has anybody heard of Transferwise? Has anybody used Transferwise? Okay, wonderful story about two Estonian Skype workers working for Skype in London. Now, they were frustrated by the time and the cost of remitting their salaries from pound sterling into their Estonian-based accounts where they grew up and lived. And so when they learnt that it was quicker to put cash in a briefcase and fly it from London to New York, they knew they were onto something. And so they set up a briefcase business in the duty-free at Terminal 3 airport in Heathrow. Just kidding. They set up Transferwise, which was an international money remittance business. Now, I was advising one of the major global banks in London in 2016, one of the top 10 banks in the world, about this exponential linear-based model and thinking, this new economic physics. When news broke that Transferwise had just achieved its third consecutive quarter of profitable growth. In other words, it had crossed that line. Now, the reaction from this bank and the leadership team was pull the price lever. And their rationale was this. Their rationale was that who in their right mind is going to give their money to a startup? Who's not going to have confidence in this 100-year-old brand, that's international, we're safe and secure. And what I was explaining to them at the time is that you're now competing in the experience economy. So your traditional notions of what gave you competitive advantage doesn't hold true in the experience economy. So anyway, they pulled the price lever. Within 30 days, they corrected that. Why? Because their model imploded. Despite the fact that they got to parity on price, their model could not accommodate the frictionless experience that Transferwise had addressed in its model of being able to move money much faster and much cheaper across international borders. Took 3 short years for Transferwise to become the #1 fintech in Europe. And so the point that I'd sort of get you to think about here is this coming decade, who is going to be the Transferwise in your industries. Because these guys are not passive hosts. They will arrive, and they're arriving at frequencies we've never seen before. And there is no indication in a world that's awash with capital, that has an unquenchable thirst for entrepreneurship, that these guys are going to go away. So let's unpack this a little. What are we seeing here? Well, we're seeing 4 distinct features. The first is this velocity. Why is it that these guys can go from nothing to ruling the roost within a really quick period of time? So our whole notion of time has profoundly changed. As I mentioned before in that chart, you know, the association, the relationship between demand and supply and time and growth has profoundly changed into this sort of exponential way of thinking. The breadth and depth, just like Transferwise, it wasn't just something that just stayed in Europe. It's right across the world now. So they internationalise very, very, very quickly, very, very rapidly. The third area is the systems impact that the fourth industrial revolution and these kinds of models are going to have. They'll traverse industries, they'll traverse countries, and they'll traverse all sorts of societies as well. And then lastly, and most importantly, it's about this word augmentation. It's the fusion between our digital physical worlds that these technologies have the capacity to achieve. Now, the good news. The Singularity University has been studying exponential organisations in the US for probably about 12 years. I've been studying them here in Australia for about 8. We now know the DNA of what makes up these exponential models and these exponential organisations. This is the DNA. This is what allows them to scale and to perform in such ways that a traditional linear or fixed model simply can't. Now, here's some examples of organisations from the third industrial revolution and from the second industrial revolution, which are deemed to be exponential models. And here's some new examples, again, of new organisations that have found their way onto the Australian ASX top 100 in a very quick period of time. Now, as mentioned earlier on, what's fueling all of this? Well, it's data. Data is the disruptor. And so when we look at the question of what Australian executives believe is going to be the most disruptive to them technologically over the coming 3 years, here's a list of all of the technologies, but what's common in all of them? It's data. Now, what I would say here is that Australian executives' participation in the fourth industrial revolution will be cyber by design. We are not prepared, I don't think, to step back from cyber and information security, as we can see here, and looking at cyber as being the #1 disruptor over the coming years. And so the question then becomes, are you ready to compete analytically? What stage of transformation, we talk about digital transformation, or what stage in data transformation is your organisations really at? Now, 2 wonderful researchers out of Harvard, their names are Davenport and Harris, solved this for us. They identified a maturity curve and life stage that organisations go through in terms of maturing to become what they describe as an analytical competitor. What is an analytical competitor? An analytical competitor is an organisation who systematically outcompetes and outperforms its competitors and peers using data. So what's a stage 5 analytical competitor look like? Google, Amazon, those kinds of guys. Capital One in the US, a financial services organisation. Progressive Insurance would be a Capital One. Ubank, I would argue, here in Australia would be a stage 5 analytical competitor as well. So with Davenport and Harris's permission, I applied their methodology across Asia Pacific and got executives to self-assess their organisations in terms of where they were at using this maturity curve. And so I'll just do a poll here. how many believe that they're working for organisations who are stage 5 analytical competitors? Hands up. That's about right. Stage 1, who believes their organisation's analytically impaired? In other words, you've got disparate data all over the place, you've got capabilities all over the place. You know, we're not getting the most out of it. So you can sort of see we are sort of in stages 1, 2 and 3. So, you know, with accelerant technologies like artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, now all of these new and emerging technologies, the first thing organisations are realising is the state of their data capabilities. We've left data up till the last stage to transform in order for us to participate in. Now, as I mentioned before as well, when it comes to skills, we're now waking up to the fact that not all of us have the capacity to go and headhunt a data scientist out of the US and bring them into Australia to work for our organisations. Data skills shortages are now, I believe, our national priority. And so I would urge all of you as digital leaders, you've embraced digital literacy, embrace data literacy. It is so important. I don't believe that within the next 3 years there'll be any roles in organisations that won't require a proficiency in the use of data. And so the way with which we think about workforce planning now has become a real priority. And so UTS has come up with a wonderful artificial intelligence system that allows organisations to map the competencies and skill sets of their current workforces and then to forecast what new skills they'll require and then to map right down to an individual level a personalised learning pathway for each individual to get them to the skill sets that they need in the right number at the right point in time. Now, what's fascinating about what UTS have done is that they've also included within their AI system what's referred to as an adaptive capacity. So we can't just come at this and think we're going to sheep dip everyone. You know, everybody is going to learn how to program, whether you like it or not. So adaptive capacity refers to, you know, the capacity of people to learn. And no two people are the same when it comes to learning. And so the combination, I think, of this adaptive capacity as well as this platform to allow organisations to now map the new skills that they're going to require in their organisations is going to go a long way to fixing these issues. Okay, let's now swing on to looking at some technological shifts. Again, think of this as like the corners and what might be around the corner. We often hear about these technologies discussed and spoken about individually, but what I would argue is that we've got to think about them collectively. Now, this is a bit of a roadmap of which the World Economic Forum and other leaders believe we will start seeing momentum being gained by these emerging technologies. The Internet of Things is already here. Organisations, factories, logistics, buildings are becoming smarter through the deployment of new sensory technology, optimising energy, for example. 3D printing will allow us to print on demand. It doesn't matter necessarily where the factory needs to be located. We'll be able to utilise 3D printing across all sorts of different consumer and industrial goods and services. We'll also see the sharing economy take on much greater momentum, again, as we start relinquishing this sort of principle of, or this need to own goods and services. And of course, we'll see at the back end of the decade, we'll start seeing much greater numbers of autonomous vehicles. So let's now look at this. And again, the idea that I'd like you to sort of think about here is the clustering effect. So what happens, for example, you know, when we put AI and the cloud together? What happens in our capacity then to run analysis at scale and rates that we simply can't do today? What happens to our computational scale? What happens when we start combining the Internet of Things, 5th generation wireless technologies, and task-specific hardware and virtual reality? All of a sudden, the way people experience goods and services, the way they experience the world profoundly changes. What happens then when we add distributed ledger into the mix and the way that we think about privacy, identity, and security? And then lastly, when we put this through quantum computing, what problems are we then able to solve using the computational power that today's computing environment simply doesn't have? So, what are some of the areas that I think this is going to play out and impact? The first area is that you're going to see this blurring of the lines between where an industry begins and ends. We're already seeing that, but I think now as you start seeing the augmentation of players who are more advanced in data, we'll start seeing a lot more of this with the use of these technologies. We'll see value creation shift by the augmentation of our digital and physical environments. Now, this is already here. We already experience this through Facebook, Uber, Airbnb. Those guys don't own transport, they don't own property, they don't own media, but they've become the largest in their categories over the years through this sort of exponential model, and we'll see much more of that. Reimagining our core in relation to the combination of AI, quantum computing, as well as cloud. And then lastly, we'll see new processes that are completely autonomous emerge and replace processes like we have today. And I'll give you an example of that around compliance and around auditing. Auditing is something that's done retrospectively. It's done using yesterday's data. And it's time-based, it's historical-based. Well, why shouldn't they be ongoing? Why can't they be ongoing? Well, the reality is they can through these technologies. So in other words, the ability for any organisation to understand right in every single moment its audit position and posture will be possible. Okay, let's talk about the programmatic decade. This is the fusion of our digital, physical, and biological worlds. Now, these are just some of the developments that we can expect to see this coming decade. The use of nanobots to treat illnesses that affect each and every one of us to a level of precision that today's medicines simply cannot do. To be able to customise a treatment plan right down to an individual is a very powerful idea and will be possible through the use of nanobot technology. Virtual reality will be reality. It will be very difficult to distinguish the difference between the two as we start seeing much greater processing and visual capabilities be, consumerised through our, 3D glasses, through augmented reality, through our phones and other areas. And we'll start seeing computers having human-level intelligence by the back end of the decade. So let's sort of unpack this in 4 areas. Let's look at the digital world. Now, now these are just some of the examples and some of the predictions that I've made about each of these throughout the book. But again, corporate audits and compliance and governance, these are major cost drivers that occupy a lot of capital, occupy a lot of labour, and are fraught with risk. We all know that. But through the use of these new technologies, artificial intelligence, blockchain, there is no reason why these processes can't be automated to operate in real time. When it comes to then looking at the physical world, global connectivity everywhere. The world is about to be washed with satellites through a range of different providers Elon Musk's SpaceX is about to wash the world with about 4,000 satellites. Now, to give you an appreciation of what that 4,000 means, there's only 3,000 up there at the moment. In the next 2 years, he's going to drop 4,000 up there. There's another 2 players that are going to put another 4,000 to 5,000 constellations of satellites all around the world. So what does this really mean? It just means that connectivity will be seamless, whether we are going across geographical boundaries, whether we're going within buildings. Connectivity won't be perhaps the issue that we see it as being today. Our biological world, I mentioned before about nanobots. We'll start seeing body organs becoming transplanted that have been 3D printed. We'll start seeing a lot of these developments in genomic sequencing. We're seeing this being played out in how they can pinpoint precisely where the origins of a COVID virus is, as we're seeing what's happened in Victoria. And then lastly, in terms of our environmental world, there's really 2 major developments that we can expect to see here. Our world will become cleaner and it will be extended into space. And we'll see a lot more about all of the developments that are going on in space right around the world in Europe, China, as well as the United States. When you think about what you're going to be experiencing in 2030, these are the results of the research that I conducted for the book. I've got some bad news, unfortunately, for Richard Branson and Elon Musk. We don't see space travel as being one of the desirable things that we'd like to be experiencing in 2030. But you can see that in the whole area of medicine and science is where we expect to see most of those advancements and developments. Now, when it comes to looking at a future retrospective, I think this is one of the things that is really intrinsic in Australian society, and that is that we look with optimism about the role of technology and science in relation to improving our social, cultural and economic future. And so I think that quintessentially captures the sentiment of Australians this coming decade, is that we do look with great optimism about the role that technology and science will play in our future, but we are also deeply concerned that our governments, that our industries are not investing adequately in those areas, which I think was the point made earlier on about where do we want to be when it comes to innovation. We've had some great innovations earlier on in our history, and in fact we've probably got a greater right than anybody else if you want to go back to innovation and look at our Indigenous culture and the way with which they were using observation to monitor our environment and climate. We have a natural right to be innovative. So let's look at some predictions. Now, the law of accelerated change, this is really, really important to understand, and again comes back to the principle of what I was referring to before about this multiplication effect of information and exponential technologies. So let's look at some of the predictions of consumer experiences that we might be having over this coming decade. Now, the statistics represent the proportion of people who think we're going to be experiencing these by 2030. This is conducted by a study across 15 countries, including Australia. So when it comes to the body, we've become accustomed to monitoring our heart rates, monitoring our sleep. 67% of people believe that we'll also be monitoring our mental health, as well as our posture, and much greater aspects about our life. 75% of people believe that we'll see privacy guardians or guardian angels that will protect our data and our privacy from intrusion, perhaps as we experience it today. And so this is based on the belief that we're going to will increase much greater degrees of control of our data over time. 78% of people believe that our neighbourhoods will become networked and will be an extension of the way that we think about neighbourhood watch. Sustainability, we all have a role to play, and 82% of people believe that we'll be able to improve our contribution, our personal contribution, through the use of technologies in relation to sustainability. We've all experienced working from home, but 90% of people want to use much greater intelligent systems from their organisations whilst they're in the home. Explainers, we've become accustomed to Hey Siri or Google, and so 46% of us believe that these will play a much greater role in our decision making through the course of time. Connected, as I mentioned before, the world is about to become awash with connectivity in all forms and shapes, and so 83% of people believe that they'll have a seamless transition between environments, whether that's physically in terms of domestic or international, or whether that's between buildings or not. Baddie bots, 90% of people are forecasting or predicting that they'll be impacted through cyber and information security through the course of time. Content, a lot of us play games of all different types. A lot of those of us that have got young teenage boys will know the Xbox or the PlayStation enthusiasm that they have. 60% of people believe that they'll participate in more engaging content that they create. So, for example, when playing a game, what you achieved yesterday, for example, in a particular game, will be incorporated within the game. So the game's not sort of created by one to many. You'll co-create with in all sorts of content. And 70% of people believe that their lives will be much better organised through the use of artificial intelligence, where its application on social networks, for example, will play an integral role in deciding who their friends will be within their community. So how does this then come together in terms of thinking about it from an enterprise perspective? And so to give you an enterprise perspective appreciation, I've created this blueprint of what I believe the business architecture of a successful, adaptive organisation will look like in the fourth industrial revolution. We begin from the outside in. We've talked about customer experiences, about knowledge workers, and about business relationships. We've talked about the use of automated technologies, wearable technologies, machine-to-machine technologies, our supply chains becoming much more efficient through the Internet of Things and a whole range of different technologies, and spaces becoming much more intelligent, whether that's a city, whether that's an autonomous vehicle. So what's at the heart of all of this? Well, it's this central cognitive intelligence. It's about data. And as I mentioned before, we've left this principally up till the last point in time to transform our organisations around. Now, this central cognitive intelligence will then treat that data through new and emerging as well as existing platforms that allow your organisations to then create that variability, that exponential effect that the traditional technologies and fixed infrastructure, labour-intensive infrastructure simply can't do today. That'll allow your organisations to then live in the customer's time zone. What is the customer's time zone? It's real time. I'm living right now, not yesterday. Facebook have a wonderful, wonderful philosophy around this, and that is they come to work every day asking, how are we going to change the customer experience? Why do we need to change the customer experience? Because the world changed. That's why. Every single day they ask themselves that question. These technologies will allow us to live in the customer's time zone. We're about to now go into our 5th generation of mobile networks, software-defined networks, that allow these networks to put your infrastructure or treat your infrastructure as a marketplace. So if you need more bandwidth over there, you can simply do it through your control centre. If you need more storage capacity over here, you can orchestrate your infrastructure to deliver exactly what you need, when you need it, in whatever volumes you need. Now, as I mentioned before, cyber by design, trust by design. We've got to push security as far out into the perimeter as we possibly can. Why? Because your threat surface will become exponentially much, much greater than what it is today. And this is what, through the API layer, will augment your digital, physical, and biological worlds. So, let me summarise. This decade is all about the fourth industrial revolution. It is coming whether you guys are ready or not. It will not wait for you, and it'll either come over the top of you or you'll be on the receiving end of these exponential models, which again ask yourself the question, who's going to be the Transferwise in your sector? It's going to be powered by data. I can't emphasise that enough. You know, the tech companies or organisations like Amazon and Google and those guys are often referred to as tech companies. They're not tech companies, they're data companies. They began understanding the value of data, and they've built their whole businesses on the ability to understand how to monetize data. We've got to look for the corners, and we've got to try and understand what's around the corner, rather than looking at transformation as a once-off event. Think about it from an adaptation perspective, being ready for what's around the corner and reacting to it. We'll see our digital world become much more immersive. We'll see our physical world become much more connected, our biological world becoming much more augmented, and then our environmental world will be cleaner and extended into space. And so from an organisational perspective, I'd encourage you to think about your business architecture as I've sort of laid it out in terms of an outside in, because becoming a cognitive enterprise will be central to your success in the future. Now, let me bring you back to juvenescence. Juvenescence is a beautiful 19th century Latin word defined as the constant state of youthfulness. And what's now widely known is that your size, your scale, your brand is not a ticket to success in the future. And our history, our modern history, is now littered with old companies that didn't really understand this point, that in fact the key to your success is your capacity to adapt. And so in closing, I'd ask you to just think about this. How do you as leaders get your juvenescence on? You've come to an absolutely remarkable event that is filled with wonderful thoughts, ideas, but it's what you do with those ideas that becomes really, really important. And what I would say in closing is that I believe that there's a pure idea in each of your minds just waiting to be acted on. Thank you.